Jai Janendra. This is Pragya Jain from ISJS, and welcome all of you to this online monthly lecture series in Jainism. We at ISJS celebrate Jainism, and to do so, we have started this series of monthly lectures in Jainism. Today will be the fourth lecture in the series, and the topic for the day is Sending for the Sadhu, Negotiating Mendicant Presence Outside of South Asia. To present this talk, we have Professor Tine Wekemans with us from Belgium, Ghent University. The session will be chaired by Professor Prakash Ji from New Delhi. I welcome Professor Tine and I welcome Prakash Ji as well. I also welcome our pioneers at ISJS, Sulekh Ji and Shugan Ji, and I welcome all of you. Before starting the lecture, let us just recite Mangalacharan or Namukar Mantra. Please join your hands. Namo Arihantanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Ariyanam, Namo Vajjayanam, Namo Lohe Savvasanam. निश्चल निज पद में लीन मुनि नहीं भरमावे, निस्पृह निर्वांछक होय मुक्ति फल पावे। गुण मूल 28 युक्त मुनिवर को ध्यावे, अपना निर्ग्रंथ स्वरूप हम भी प्रगटावे। Thank you so much. Before the talk, I would like our Program Director and Joint Director, Dr. S.N. Pandey, to welcome all of you and the speakers and the chair and introduce the program. Dr. Pandey.
Namaskar, Jai Janendra. I welcome you all to the fourth online lecture by ISJS. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Tine Wekemans, today's speaker. She is a professor of Jainology at Ghent University, Belgium. She holds the Acharya Mahapragya Chair for Jain Studies at Ghent University, and additionally, she is a postdoctoral research fellow funded by Research Foundation of Flanders in North Belgium. Her interest in research, particularly in Jainism, is ethnography with textual study. Over the past decade, her research touched upon diverse aspects of modern Jainism, including Jain migration history, changing relations between Jain householders and ascetics, and status of Jainism in this modern digital age, etc. Professor Tine is an alumni of ISJS. She has attended our 6-week Jain Studies program in 2014. So once again, Professor Tine, I welcome you. I would like to welcome today's chairperson, Professor Prakash Chand Jain ji. He is our academic advisor and former professor of sociology from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Besides Jain studies, his academic interests include Indian immigration and diaspora, West Asian studies, population and demography, and Indian society and culture. In the field of Jain studies, Professor Jain's publications include 2 authored books, and first one is Jains in India and Abroad, published by International School for Jain Studies, Jain's Community of Bundelkhand, and 2 edited books, Social Consciousness in Jainism and studies in Jain population and demography. And just yesterday, we received a book published by ISJS with DK Printworld Delhi, Jain engagement, Jain business engagement and ethics, edited by Prakash ji, Dr. Sugan ji, and Dr. Malay Patel. So we are very lucky to have Professor Prakash ji with us. Sir, on behalf of myself and behalf of our users, I welcome you. I would like to welcome our founders, Dr. Sugan Chand Jain, Dr. Sulekh ji. I welcome you all, my colleagues here at ISGS and participants from India and abroad. I welcome you all. Over to you, Pragya ji.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. So it's time to start the lecture. I think if you are trying to unmute yourself or turn on your cameras, you will not be able to do that for security purposes. And if you have any questions, you can just raise your hands at the end of the talk so that we can have a little chat with Professor Wickermans. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to share my screen in a competent manner. Let's see. I'm gonna try to minimize all of these. Yes, okay. So you should be seeing a squirrel on the stairs at Palitana. Yes? Okay. I'm gonna assume that's yes.
Yes, yes.
All right. Perfect. Let me start by thanking all of you who tuned in, but especially all of you guys at ISJS for making today's lecture possible. As Dr. Pandey already indicated, we have a long-established relationship, as I was in the summer school program in 2014. I had then, just a few months before, started my PhD at Ghent University, and I was planning to look into the experience and practice of Jains living outside of South Asia in what is collectively called the diaspora. The focus of this research was to be the entanglements of this diaspora population with digital media, what role digital media played in the way they practiced and experienced Jainism. But as I started my fieldwork and I discussed and participated, observed and interviewed, of course, a whole range of topics directly or indirectly related to Jainism passed review. And today's talk is actually based on one of these things that happened during fieldwork, which had very little to do with this focus on digital media, but which had a profound effect on me nonetheless. So that is why today's lecture is titled Sending for the Sadhu, Negotiating Mendicant Presence Outside of South Asia. Now, let me first start by saying what this lecture is not meant to be. I am not at all trying to assess how Jain doctrine should be interpreted or how Jains should or should not practice Jainism. Rather, this is quite a personal story, really, of how my own ideas and understanding on Jainism was challenged by things that happened during my fieldwork. And from both these preconceptions that I held and the challenges that I then faced, I started reflecting on ways of studying Jainism. And I want, with this talk, I really just aim to launch a methodological appeal, which to an extent is a re-appeal, but I'll get to that, for studying Jainism as a living tradition. But let's start with these preconceptions, with my understanding of what Jainism is. And I call that, as a sort of shorthand, baseline Jainism. And baseline Jainism is a Jainism that you find in most handbooks and introductions on Jainism. Now, handbooks and introductions are always constrained by a number of pages, by the sort of previous knowledge and attention span of their audience, which, when discussing something as broad and as historically diverse as Jainism, is quite something to have to do. So very understandably, they tend to focus on structures, ideas, and books, things that are held in common by a large group of Jains. So in that way, we build a type of knowledge, and people who grow up Jain and are socialized in a Jain family learn Jainism in a different way, of course. But this is how, coming from outside, people tend to learn Jainism. So what does that entail? Jainism is a South Asian religious tradition. The 24th enlightened teacher of Jainism, Mahavir, lived in the 6th century before Common Era. Jainism as a tradition has a strong focus on the individual spiritual progress of the soul towards moksha. And that happens through a series of rebirths, which is sort of organized through an intricate system of karma. What else do we learn about Jainism from this baseline approach? We learn that there's a lay and a mendicant community, Shravak, Shravika, Sadhu, Sadhvi. And we learn that for all these 4 groups, the 5 main principles are essentially the same. And they're the basis of what will become Jain ethics. But the way that these 5 principles are translated in codes of conduct are different, quite staggeringly different, because they are much more stringent for mendicants, making the tradition towards mendicant life from a previous life as a householder quite a big step, making mendicant life quite an ascetic and a harsh existence. The illustration here is Mahavir getting ready to pluck out his hair under an Ashoka tree. It's a manuscript from the 15th century. Now, what of course, from a more sociological background interests me a lot is how these lay and mendicant communities then interact. And it turns out that although their lives are quite different, they are intricately intertwined. The lay community makes sure that the mendicant community can be fed through alms, gets support and medication when needed and required. The mendicant community then is important as a symbol for spiritual progress, locus of devotion, and they provide counsel and teaching on both Jain doctrine, but also in worldly affairs. Now, that is usually where handbooks end. The diaspora is usually not present in that narrative, in that baseline narrative at all. However, we can infer some things when we look at the differences in the application of the 5 vratas, for example. And one of the things we can infer is that there's a significant difference in mobility. Mendicants having to lead a peripatetic life for most of the time, but not being allowed to use mechanized transport and being reliant on a sufficiently large Jain community for alms and support, have a high mobility, but within a limited radius. Loosely translated, they can't really sort of support themselves outside of India. Lay Jains then have always, to an extent, migrated across the subcontinent for political reasons, for reasons of business opportunity, etc. But we see that from the second half of the 19th century, there's a significant rise in international mobility of lay Jains, and that is within a global radius. So from that would follow, and that was also my expectation, that mendicants are absent outside of South Asia. Now, from what I'd already done before the event that will be pivotal to this talk, I knew that people in the diaspora had ways to deal with this. Some people lamented the fact that there was no option for authentic mendicant lay interaction. But then a lot of people in their home shrines had pictures, had books, had recordings that they really sort of held in high esteem and they really cherished. One respondent in Antwerp and another in London actually told me that they took trips to India specifically to spend time with sadhus and sadhvis, even to walk with them and to live with them for a time. And then more often I would hear of indirect communication. People, when seeking advice from sadhus and sadhvijis, that would call family members in India and then have their question sort of asked for them. So all of that was going on, and this is how I understood the situation to be, until a very memorable encounter in Atlanta. And I remember it's so memorable that I remember the exact layout of the hotel room, which isn't my usual forte. I was standing in the hotel room looking out over the park, which was adjacent to the hotel, when I saw I had a voicemail message. And it was from the lady that I had arranged to meet later that day for an interview. She's a member of the Atlanta Jain Sangh, of whom you see the temple in the picture. Now, the voicemail message went as follows. I'm afraid we will have to reschedule our interview today, but if you can make it, please do come to our house. This will be interesting for you. A Sadhuji is coming for lunch. And I listened to it again and again. A Sadhuji is coming for lunch. I was quite confused, but being an ethnographer, I shake off my confusion and I take my notebook and I took an Uber, I believe, and I went to their house to see what exactly was going on. And during that lunch and sort of the non-alcoholic aperitif which preceded it, I stayed in the background, I sat at the edge and I observed. And I made notes during and straight after this encounter. And from the notes I took, it's very clear that I was really confused. I have this passage for you. The question marks and the exclamation marks and the underlining are actually also in my written notes. So I write that there's about 10 people present, all with their attention fixed upon the Sadhuji, question mark, who was installed in what was clearly the place of honor. He was dressed in white. The man of the house and a family friend were seated on either side, and these three men were engaged in lively conversation on the sadhu's work in Hong Kong, question mark, exclamation mark, while eating together, passing dishes to each other, etc. The lady of the house was less involved in the conversation, but was beaming, clearly honored to have this sadhuji in her house. So from my notes, you can sort of feel my confusion. This was not what I thought was possible to find. From what I knew, the stringent rules imposed on Jain mendicants made it absolutely impossible for them to be in that place, to sit down with lay followers for a festive meal as this sadhu did, hence the question marks. Now, subsequently, I did get a chance to talk with this sadhuji for some time while he was whisked off to a next appointment in the car. I took the liberty of joining him. And I learned that he had resided in Hong Kong since 2004. His name is Nirmal Sagar, and he used to be a mendicant in India, but he left his order, but felt compelled to share his wisdom with Jain adherents in other places, overseas. At the time of our interview, he gave regular religious classes in Hong Kong, but also traveled for occasional lectures elsewhere. So for me, and you might laugh, and that is absolutely fine. You might laugh at my slight naivete. For me, this was really a pivotal moment, something that, looking back on it, I sort of might even call an epistemological break. There I borrow from French philosophy, where an epistemological break is when an obstacle which has impeded the development of a certain type of knowledge is removed and access is gained to new modes of thinking and analysis. It felt that, like in my understanding of Jainism, a new door had appeared and a room was found there. And I could go into that room, I could look around, I could try and see how big it was. I could also stand in that new place and look back at my knowledge of Jainism as a whole, from a different perspective. And my fieldwork went on, but I'd already had some fieldwork and I'd been at ISJS, the summer school before. And this encounter, this in my head impossible encounter, sort of made other things fall into place. As part of my ISSJS experience, I'd been to interview an Acharya called Acharya Lokesh Muni in an apartment in Delhi, and he showed me pictures he had with sort of famous American people. And I'd been there and I'd been asking him things about Jain minority status. So again, something entirely different. And I know that I found it very weird that a Jain Muni with a Mukpati and everything would be showing me this. But at the time, it was just too weird and I didn't ask more questions. And then I remembered that when I was doing my BA, at certain points, a Jain nun had visited our university in Belgium. And at the time, I hadn't questioned it. But thinking back on that, that was pretty weird and confusing too. And moving on with my fieldwork, I started actually realizing that when people were enthusiastically informing me that a Sadhuji would visit their school in London, this was actually what was happening. In this case, the school, SCVP school in London, is an affiliate of Virayatan, and the Sadhuji whose visit was impending was Shilapiji, and she actually visited. I talked to other people in different places as well, and all of a sudden, I was able to see what I had sort of not been able to process before, and that is mendicant presence in the diaspora outside of South Asia. So then, wanting to explore this more, I started looking into who travels. And there you see a number of individual mendicants who decide to travel. And this sort of picks up from mainly from the 70s, with one notable exception, which is a bit earlier, Muni Jin Vijayji, who traveled in the beginning of the 20th century. And these individual mendicants, for most of them, the decision to travel abroad meant stepping out of their mendicant lineage. Some of them, after doing this, decided to base themselves outside of South Asia. In the US, you have Chitra Banu and Sushil Kumar, who've both since passed away, but they were very influential also in establishing this North American Jainism and Jaina as an organization, with an influence well beyond North America as well. And you also have more recently Acharya Sri Yogesh, whose organizations sort of speak more to Western converts and more syncretic Hindu Jain ideas, but still he's the first Acharya to actually conduct a Diksha ceremony in the US with Western followers, but still. Then you have Nirmal Sagar, who's based in Hong Kong, and Satish Kumar, a Gandhian peace activist who based himself in the UK after leaving his mendicant lineage. Then you have others that are based in India, but do travel or have traveled abroad. Muni Jim Vijayji was probably the first and the historically most well-known. But in that same line, you have this Acharya Dr. Lokesh Muni, whom I visited without realizing who I was visiting. You have Muni Jin Chandraji, who's in the picture. And we could also add Kanji Swami to the list, who only traveled once in the year he died in 1980 to open a temple in Kenya, but still, he did travel. Now, I have here sort of categorized them as settlers and visitors in the diaspora. There is also a categorization which sort of prompts itself between former and independent mendicants, but that is a bit of a more contentious distinction to make. But still, if we look at how these, and these are all men, there are some Sadhvijis and former Sadhvijis as well. This is not an exhaustive list. But if we look at how these people want their followers, want others to refer to them, we can group some firmly under the category of former. Both Muni Jim Vijayji and Kanji Swami specifically said they were to be addressed as lay gurus. Chitra Banu and Satish Kumar both got married and had a family, which also, if not explicitly, very practically puts them outside of the purview of sort of a Jain mendicant. But then the names that are still in black, you see Sushil Kumar, Sri Yogesh, Lokesh Muni, and Jinchandraji, they actually all kept their mendicant titles. They re-established or established a mendicant lineage or an organization which resembles a lineage around themselves. So they actually function as mendicants. But even if you make this distinction, you have to, if you observe what's going on, a lot of these former monks still behave in certain ways that are reminiscent of monkhood, in the way they dress, in the way they act. For example, Chitrabhanu is very famous for having arrived in the US without a penny on him, because Jain sadhus don't handle money. So he had actually flown from India to the West, but that did not mean he actually started handling money straight away. So there's a lot of diversity in behavior, but the symbolic capital and some of the outward appearances of even the most former of former monks still remind of mendicancy and monkhood. Now, in addition to these individual traveling monks, you have a couple of instances of institutionalized mendicant travel. Two of those are actually historical, both in the Digamber tradition with the Bataraks, for a discussion about whom I refer to my former colleague who's now in Bochum, Tilo de Tige's work, and Yatis, for a broader explanation of whom I refer to Eric Villalobos, who's actually here, who studied at SOAS and is now at Atlanta. So both these groups have been established centuries ago and allow this category of mendicant some form of mechanized travel. Another group where we have the Terapan, Saman, and Samani, but also the Amarmuni Sampradaya, the lineage behind the much more well-known charity organization Virayatam, they are newer instances where we see institutionalized mendicant travel made possible. In Therapant with the Samanis, it's clearly sort of a separate category of mendicant. They do take the same vows as fully initiated monks, but with a few exceptions specifically geared towards being able to engage with global audiences. Only in this Amarmuni Sampradaya is it possible for a fully initiated monk or nun to travel without any loss of status or any exceptions made. Yeah. Now, these newer established forms of medical travel that are institutionalized, so the Saman Samani and then in Amarmuni Sampradaya, they clearly sort of came into being partly under the influence of these individual traveling monks. That idea, that the fact that more and more monks actually did on an individual basis decide to travel and to engage with global audiences, sparked discussions in a lot of mendicant lineages in India about whether this should be the core business of a mendicant to start with. And if they then wanted to engage more with global audiences, what might be permissible and what might not be. And here you can actually link in discussions all through the 20th century about the use of microphones, the use of video cameras, it being okay or not okay to specifically sort of perform a pravachan for YouTube audiences, etc., etc. So that's an interesting group of discussions that have been going on. And even though the number of lineages that actually say, okay, mechanized travel is no longer a bar, the fact that these discussions do go on and are being held is in itself quite interesting. That said, I group another quite sort of, that this is maybe rather contentious, but also in this group of mendicants and mendicant-like figures who travel, I place the guru traditions in the Srimad Raj Chandra tradition. That is, the two active ones right now are Srimad Raj Chandra Mission Dharampur and Sri Raj Sabak Saila, with Gurudev Rakesh Zaveri and Bhai Shri Nalimbai Kotari as gurus. Now, before you stop me and say, well, Tina, these are not mendicants, well, they're not, and they also don't pretend they are. However, if you look at how they interact with their followers, and if you look from a diaspora studies point of view at how popular they are, they can sort of, for today's narrative, be seen as mendicant-like figures. They take up, at least in part, that role that is traditionally sort of the mendicant role in that lay-mendicant relationship. So those travel as well. And altogether, these three groups, the individual ones, the institutionalized travel, and then these guru traditions make for at least a non-zero mendicant or mendicant-like presence in the diaspora. You can actually encounter these people. But why did they decide to travel? Why do so? And to illustrate that, I'm gonna give you a couple of excerpts from a book that I'm currently translating by Yati Hemchandra. It's a travelogue of his time in Aden and in East Africa. But it starts in Karachi, where he has his chaturmas. And it is in Karachi that he meets the person in the picture. This is actually a picture of a picture, which is in a diner in Kenya, just as a side note. Sri Bhagwanji Hansraj, at that time a leading activist of anything Jain in Mombasa, also co-founder of the Navnat organization there. And he asked him, Maharaj Sri, will you come to Mombasa? And the Yati in question says, I was surprised, Mombasa. For a Jain Yati, this is indeed a matter of wonder, and I well understood what such an endeavor would mean. So note in passing that even though Yatis are normally allowed mechanized travel, crossing the ocean in a boat is quite a different ballgame. The benefits I have received through listening to your lectures, says Sri Bhagwanji Hansraj, could also greatly benefit of Gujarati brothers who have settled there. And if you do not provide these brothers of ours living far away with such benefit, who will? Sort of this first encounter sets Yati thinking. What is he going to do? Is this something that he should engage in? Because even for a Yati, it is a large step. And then very interestingly, a vision appears before his eyes, and he sees this specter who tells him, what's the problem? I traveled 3 times. I lectured at universities in Europe, and along with that, Jainism was propagated. Society developed a curiosity about Jain philosophy. I converted many carnivores to vegetarianism, softened the hearts of the bloodthirsty, and spread the glow of the lamp of knowledge far and wide, as it should be. So what is stopping you? And then he reveals in this book that this was the figure of Muni Shri Jinvijayji. I saluted him. I decided I must go to Africa. So it's interesting that one traveling mendicant refers to another traveling mendicant to help him in his decision. But still, we keep on reading about being conflicted. In a later part, actually, as he's getting on the boat to go to Aden, he's eventually was invited to go to East Africa first, but the paperwork and getting permission to go there took a long time. And in the meanwhile, the Jain community in Aden had heard he'd said yes to that kind of invitation, so they quickly invited him. And as Aden was part of the sort of British Indian Empire, that was easier to do. So he goes to Aden first, and he's standing there, he's about to board the boat. And he says, on the one hand, I was going abroad to spread religious knowledge. On the other, the enthusiasm of the people was like the motherland calling me back. So these are the people that are standing sort of quayside looking at the boat. I was conflicted. There were different kinds of merit in both options. A voice from my heart dispelled this feeling. You can go and accomplish great things, but how will you ever see your destination if worldly infatuation turns you back at the first step? A sentence echoed in my mind. Where there is motherland, there is attachment. And with this line in my mind, I boarded the steamer and that would take me to Aden. Now it's interesting, again, note in passing, that he does sort of reflect on different kinds of merit in both options. And it is also very interesting to me that essentially he says, well, this want of staying here is perhaps a form of attachment. So it would actually be a sort of a proper mendicant exercise to do, to let go of that and go into the world as planned. Now, other mendicants who traveled, like Chitrabhanu, had actually from their own writings and writings of those who traveled with them, had similar things in mind. So with Chitrabhanu, the situation is he gets an invitation to go to a conference in Geneva in 1970. And he really debates on whether he needs to do this or not. And he says, well, is it not a Jain sadhu's duty to minister Jains wherever they live? But what about this ban? How can the spiritual hunger of thousands of diaspora Jains in Africa, the UK, and the US be satisfied? And then he remembers a tearful father about talking about the dilemmas of his son who was in the US studying and not being able to receive any religious guidance. And on that, with that, he does decide to leave. And just as our Yati Hemchandra refers to Jim Vijayji, it's interesting that Chitrabhanu, in his thinking, really had a special place for Virchand R. Gandhi, who was probably the first Jain to ever visit the US for the Parliament of World Religions, and then is seen here in the picture teaching Jainism to an American lady. So again, we have one monk deciding to travel, referring to another, in this case, lay Jain teacher who decided to travel for the benefit of global audiences, non-Jain as well as Jain. Taking the reverse perspective a little bit, this is a post on a Facebook group written by the great grandchild of a Jain who lived in Kenya and met Kanji Swami in Mombasa. And she writes that it was a pivotal event for her great-grandfather that led him to take Jain Dharma, make Jain Dharma a much larger part of his life. It was his dream to create a mandir here in London, and she then said his dream was realized in his lifetime. And when I speak to people who lived in diaspora communities where these first traveling monks visited, you often hear that this was a pivotal event. This meeting with Kanji Swami, in this case, led to well, the religious focus of a man, but also the creation of one of London, Harrow's Jain temples, the Digambar temple. I recently spoke to a lady who said, well, before the visit of Chitrabhanu to my family, I didn't realize we were Jain. I just thought we were, you know, like a brand of Hindus. And it's Chitrabhanu who came to us and said, no, this Jain identity is important and you should pay attention to it and you should organize around it. So summarized, in all of these instances where we know what motivated mendicants to start traveling and formally or informally leave their lineage, the propagation of Jainism is a really strong reason there, both towards international audiences, but also supporting Jains outside of South Asia. And although these communities were there and they had to an extent established organizations and temples, etc., we see that often a visit by such a traveling mendicant can really sort of cause a change or a new organization or funding for a new charity or that kind of thing. So they can be really quite impactful. Now back to my confusion, because looking back at it, I was really quite sort of surprised at how confused I was and how much sort of my assumptions of something being impossible had also before that encounter with the Sadhu at lunch, how much I had not picked up on. I had been with Acharya Lokesh Muni, I had interacted with the Samani. However, the penny hadn't dropped. And that is in large part due to how non-Jains learn about Jainism. we really sort of look at these handbooks, and through no fault of their own, very understandably, they all seem to have the same focus on the greatest common denominators. But then we come to my points. That is a bit of a dangerous thing, because that leaves us with a focus, which is also historically in Jaina studies been the focus, on doctrine and doctrinal texts. And that sometimes consciously, very often unconsciously, leads to this idea of Jainism as being fixed, as being unchangeable. But that sells the tradition short, in the sense that Jainism is and should be celebrated as a living tradition. Now, John Court, already in 1990, made a similar observation that we should perhaps have more of an eye for the study of Jains and how individuals practice Jainism rather than this doctrine. Because, as he also noted, historically, we've sort of, not seen things. And the way to do this, and this is sort of my own interpretation, goes a little bit further than John Court does in his article. It's essential that we can step back from the idea of an orthodox core. That does not mean that research into doctrinal text is factually incorrect or is not worthy. It definitely is. But to be able to make sense of situations like this, we really need to step back from it and see religious practice in Jainism, but also in other traditions, perhaps as a series of developments and experiments, both on an individual and a collective level, which are dependent on the context and the needs of the time. And often, if you sort of, if these developments are talked about in scholarly literature, but also in Jain literature often, they're sort of denounced as something, well, yeah, but it's a compromise. They don't know any better. It's essentially the equivalent of Kali Yuga. But my point today is, well, from sort of the scientific study of Jainism as a whole, Kali Yuga is really not an argument we can use. So no, it is not just that. This is how a living tradition works. And what my encounter in Atlanta really showed for me, and I'm trying to share that experience with you guys, is that we need to make room for the diversity of practice and contradictions, which are inevitably part of a living tradition. Meaning that the anger at Chitrabanu's, the anger of Chitrabanu's followers when he tried to catch his plane in Bombay and they were trying to sort of make sure he didn't get there, that anger was legit. However, so was his decision to travel. The devotion that speaks out of the tone of my respondent's voice when she says, oh, Sadhu is coming to lunch, that is not a lie. That is a sincere sense of devotion. But then when other people in other parts of diaspora perhaps tell me that they lament the impossibility of authentic lay mendicant interaction, that is actually also a sincere sentiment, and that is also legitimate. And all of these things need to be able to find a place in how we see Jainism. So in conclusion, what have I been talking about today? Jain mendicants, former mendicants, and figures who functionally take a part of the role of mendicants are present outside of South Asia. And much more than we often think. And we, in this case, is both non-Jain scholars of Jainism, but also Jains in India at times. And this is not a recent development. The picture you see here is of the Yati, from whose book, the translation of whose book I've been citing, who visited Aden and East Africa, I'm sorry, in 46. And here he is in Nairobi with the local Oshwal committee. So this is not recent, but it has been spurred to a large degree by this growing diaspora, as well as global events related to interfaith, spirituality, vegetarianism, which sort of asked for input from Jain specialists, and then Jain mendicants were, of course, sort of high on the list of possible speakers. Now, the visits and the presence of these people in the diaspora has historically had quite an impact on the assertion of Jain identity and organization, in the sense that here you have Sushil Kumar and Chitra Banu together. They've had a huge impact on Jainism in North America. But also in East Africa and in London, you have SCVP school being present, which ties to Virayatam, which ties to Acharya Chandanaji's lineage. So all of these things have had quite an impact. Again, as we saw, the London Digambar Temple in Harrow is a direct result of Kanji Swami's visit, one and only visit to Kenya. But it is an uneven development. So if you're now all sort of excited and you expect to find Jain mendicants or mendicant-like figures behind every corner in the diaspora, that is also not the case. There are still places where this small but sort of relevant mendicant presence does not sort of come. London is a lovely place for this, because London has Samanijis staying permanently. London also has SCVP schools, so regular visits by Sadhu Shilapiji, who you see here. London has active Srimad Rajchandra groups of both active lineages, so they regularly have both Baishri and Rakesh Zaveri visiting. The Batarak often comes to SOAS for events, so London sees a lot of this, as do some of the major cities in North America. If you're a Jain in Switzerland, then this is much less relevant for you. And for those people, the sense of the total mendicant absence in diaspora still holds true. But, and that was sort of the main point I want to make, we need to make room to see this. Not that the textual, doctrinal, or to use the word orthodox core of Jainism has no merit. Of course it has. But the constant comparison of practices and sort of this gauging on how far they are from doctrine and from sort of core orthodoxy doesn't really help us in studying Jainism as a lived tradition, as I think we should definitely approach it. So that is where I will leave you guys with a last remark. This talk is loosely based on a published chapter, or an almost published chapter. It will come out by the 30th of May, but it's available, the book is available for sort of, what do you call that? You can pre-order it through the website of Routledge. And this is especially for those of you who teach South Asian religions or religions classes. It's really quite a handy and a nifty handbook, and I'm glad to be part of that. And with that, I will thank all of you for being here and for bearing with me. If you thought me quite naive in my confusion, that is absolutely fine. But I hope that perhaps sharing my my experiences has the effect of not every one of you having to go through that same process. If you are someone like me who always thinks of really great questions about a day after a talk is done, feel free to email me. I'll gladly interact with you later. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop share.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. There were great observations and you spoke from your heart. So the talk was lovely. I would request the audience, if they have any questions, they can raise their hands. Yes, Sulekji.
First of all, I want to thank Tine for giving us this journey of last practically 130 years or so, starting from Veer Chandra Raghavji Gandhi. I've been here half of the time, but I did not look at all this development in that fashion. So you have covered many, many areas. One area probably, Tine, you might like to cover is the presence of some of these people in the academia. And by that I mean is, if I just, Kanji Swami in North America, in his name, we have his presence in University of Florida, These are programs or chairs or whatever you call, University of Connecticut, Arizona State University, and also at SOAS in London. These are all named after Kanji Swami in some way or the other. Okay, your own position at Ghent University is named as Acharya Mahapragya Ji. And out of all of this, if anything happened 6-7 years ago, we established Srimad Rajchandra Chair at University of California at Riverside with Anna Beisel. Okay, these are new developments, you know, from mendicants and connecting with the lay community, and then going into the university. Okay, that's new development, and many other things that happen. Only thing that we faced, some of those people who have been here, as these people started coming, especially in 1970s and 80s and 90s, Jena, we tried to establish some code of conduct for all these people, and we failed. We tried very, very hard, and many reasons, but some of these people who had come here, they did not want to be controlled by a lay people organization, and they did not want any kind of restrictions put on them. Okay, so that's our failure. We just did not succeed. Okay, so we tried. So these are the comments I just wanted to know that you might like to look further.
Yeah, can I briefly react to that? Of course, the fact that in these academic chairs and also just, you know, on non-academic organizations, it's an interesting sort of intricate two-way process where those groups in India that are more open to global audiences and that actively seek to interact with them, they automatically, you know, become a little bit more popular in diaspora because that's the groups that they have access to. And that sort of, you know, that triggers more interaction and then those build. That does not mean, however, that Jains in diaspora don't have profound respect for those lineages that decided not to go in for digital media use or international travel. Many of my respondents sort of profess both respect for these more traditional approaches as well as sort of devotion and respect for the mendicants that do travel. But that is why you sort of balance-wise, you have a lot of visibility of these guru traditions, of Kanji Swami, of Srimad Rajchandra, of Virayatan to an extent, of the Therapant, because they're there. And especially in diaspora and for second-generation diasporas, as your personal sort of sectarian affiliation sort of becomes less important and a more general Jain identity takes over, it becomes more easy to sort of go for what you can find. And in London, but I very much assume in the US it will be the same, you will find people at lectures by the Samanijis, but then see them at the Srimad Rajchandra event as well. And when Chandanaji used to visit and when Shilapiji visits, everyone's there, regardless of their opinion about this Amar Muni Sampradaya or their affiliation, their sectarian affiliation with them or with someone else. So that's one thing that links into these academic chairs and their names to an extent. And then regarding the code of conduct, it's interesting. Of course, sometimes there's an element of sort of struggle for power. Because as I briefly indicated, these communities in East Africa, but also in London, also in the US, they were already developing. In East Africa, there were temples before there was ever a sadhu or a yati coming in. There were structures being built up. So although a visit of or the permanent presence of a mendicant can have a profound impact, not everyone necessarily agrees with everything that then happens. And you see in a few cases that there's sort of, you know, there's an uneasy coexistence between the two, where there is sort of respect and devotion for the sort of the learning and the symbolic capital that is brought in, but at the same time there's this feeling of, yeah, okay, but you know, let us do this. And then you have this idea of lay authority, which, you know, was there in absence of mendicant authority and then clashing a little bit. So I can assume that that is also in part what happens when sort of the Jaina Code of Conduct, which is really sort of emphasizing non-sectarianism, and I'm assuming that's what you're sort of indicating, where that sits uneasily with those mendicants coming in who do profess a specific sort of adherence to lineage. But yeah, thank you for these remarks. I will look into them further.
Thank you. We have Mr. Shalin Jain raising his hand. Shalin ji.
Am I audible?
Yes, we hear you a little bit, but talk.
Okay, fine. Very good evening, indeed, it was very
Okay, Shalinji, I have to bring you bad news that you are barely audible. So maybe can you type your question in the chat? Do we have a chat?
Yeah, sure, I will do that. I'll do it. I'll do it.
In the meanwhile, is there anyone else? I think chat is not available. Is available, isn't?
Pragya?
Hanji, Shubhaji.
Tine, when
Yes.
we see this trend, you know, this is the technical term we use is Shiism. That from Mahdi's time, you know, the tradition has been going through a series of changes resulting in sects, subsects, and mostly you see they are to bring laxity in the conduct of ascetics. So the ascetics, you know, they bring some laxity, and because it is not acceptable by majority at that time, so they start a new sect. Now, you know, we see the same thing, that some of these are going overseas. And they say that we want to teach, we want to, you know. Now, my question is, as one of the promoters of ISJS, why a saint has to teach? Why he has to go to teach? Is that the only purpose? Or the purpose is something else? And they are taking it as a guard that they want to teach it.
That is something that is quite impossible to answer, of course, because it's very, very individual, I assume. I mean, in some of these figures' decisions to travel, there will be other more private sort of reasons to do so. And it is actually, I mean, it's a legitimate discussion that has been going on in different lineages in India. And I sort of assume to an extent in all ascetic groups, mendicant groups in India. Is this reaching out to global audiences, both Jain and non-Jain? Is this actually our core business? Is this what a Jain mendicant should be doing? And there are still many groups that say, you know, even recorded lectures on YouTube and whatnot, this is not what we do. You take Diksha, you become a monk or a nun to focus on your own spiritual progress. So you should be studying and meditating and, you know, fasting and behaving in accordance with that as the only goal. But of course, there is some discussion about that. And I'm not sure if it's correct to say that it's always about laxity of conduct. I mean, historically, there's also been a few splits where it was more the assertion of wanting to be more strict rather than an assertion of wanting laxity that caused schisms and whatnot. So I think in that sense, I'm glad I'm an ethnographer and not a Jain. I don't have to make that value call. And I think from a scientific point of view, it's probably good not to make it, or at least not to make it too soon, because that's one of the things why these things remain under the radar and we seem to be incapable of looking at them. But yeah, should it be them that goes to teach? I mean, Veerchand Gandhi was a lay teacher, and he went to teach, and that was, you know, that is a neutral thing. That was his thing that he could do. And even then, not the entire Jain community at the time was not super pleased about it. But he had not taken any vows to stay in India and to not use mechanical transport. So why not? And that's a very valid point. They could just leave it up to lay teachers and lay people to go and do that. However, as we've seen in the way that these African Jain communities sort of reached out to the Yatis, there is, in many cases, an active question of diaspora communities for at least a visit of mendicant and mendicant-like people. And I think part of that comes from sort of, especially with generations who grew up in India, a recognition of how central that mendicant-lay interaction, that intricate relationship is, and a want to have that. And in the same vein, there's been a couple of sort of proposals and tries to set up a Jain mendicant lineage in the diaspora, so they wouldn't have to travel. You know, if you just have a lineage in London, then they can just stay in London. No travel needed, and they can actually sort of be quite orthodox to an extent in that sense. But in London, that hasn't really flown. It was one of Nathubai Shah's ideas, who recently passed away. In the US, you have that lineage by Yogesh, Acharya Sri Yogesh, but that's, I mean, I need to include it here because he was a Jain mendicant and he does do Jain type dikshas, but his sort of philosophy is so syncretic that it doesn't really appear to appeal to South Asians in the diaspora at all. It appeals almost exclusively to Western people. So it's part and not part of this conversation. So that speaks of the same, this feeling that it is a part of what Jainism is to many people. It is something that would be nice to have, in a sense, you know, on a theoretical note. So there is, at least at times and in certain places, there was an active sort of need and an active question of the community to get that. In other times, and especially recently, maybe not as strongly, but the discussion is ongoing, and I'm glad that I can observe rather than make a judgment call.
You know, there is an exception. You may like to know that a Jain in US, she became a mendicant and came to India, and now she's living as a Sadhu. Sangmitra, you might have heard the name, from, you know, Virayatan. So this, I think it depends more on individuals. You know, we expect something, we say something, and then the trend, you know. So thank you for.
All right. Should we have a quick question by Dr. Naveen Mehta?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
I'm from East Africa, Zanzibar. And people discount the ability of the Jain Shravak to be able to promote Jainism. Many people out there in India think only a Sadhu can do that, or Sadhu can do that. The reality is that over the centuries, the Jain sadhus were not allowed to go out of India. So who were doing their work? Who was doing their work? It was the Shravak doing it. And today, the problem is, in the past, in my days, early days, was the fact that you did not ask African, Negro African to come to your temple. But today that's not the case. The Doshi family of Mombasa has opened out the doors of the Jain temple, and you can see a couple of hundred Negro Africans singing Jain bhajans there. I was a single-handed Jain in Truro, Nova Scotia. And the professor wanted somebody to teach Jainism. And indirectly, I was approached. And I could, by relying on my basic training in Jainism, in practical Jainism, and by looking up books, I was able to give a 3-month discourse to teachers, college women and men for 3 years continuously. So please do not discount the ability of Jain Shravak to do what Jain Sadhus are supposed to be doing. If they're not available, a Jain Shravak can stand it, does stand it, and can achieve results. Thank you.
No, of course, yeah. And East Africa is actually a good example of that, because I mean, the Jain communities in Zanzibar and Tanzania and Uganda and Kenya, they've been there, and Aden to an extent. They were there, you know, by the end of the 19th century. They had a visit of a yati once in 46, and then Chitra showed up in the 70s. But there's huge, you know, periods of time between them. And it's not that the Jain communities was at a standstill at that time. Things were built up, community was built up. And in the beginning, at least, through great difficulty of trying to find books and trying to sort of get people's knowledge together to sort of form, you know, a comprehensive basis for Jain teaching, they did manage. I mean, there was in Zanzibar, there was a Jain Pachala going on long before any mendicant or mendicant-like figure thought of going there. And that is well noted, and that is true, and that is still true to the present day. So again, this comes back to what I said on Sulekji's comment in the beginning. There is an aspect of a power struggle there, where, yeah, and it's a subtle one, because a lot of Jains welcome these visits of these Jain mendicants and related figures. They do. However, developments were going on sort of outside of these visits, and sometimes they do clash. But my presentation today, I by no means want to sort of question the ability of Jain Shravaks to take up Jain teaching, because that is sort of the majority of things I see in the diaspora as well. But this was sort of an exception to the rule, which made me think of how I'd been approaching Jainism, and for that I thought it was interesting to sort of, you know, work it out, how long this had been going on and how many people there are and what the motivations are. But of course, that does not discount all of the effects of the Shravaks.
True. I think we should invite Dr. Prakashji to conclude and have the final comments. Prakashji.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, excellent talk by all means. And, you know, it's a very nicely researched topic from ethnographic point of view. And, well, you know, a few things I would like to, you know, state here for the benefit of other audiences, that Jain diaspora in East Africa began sometime in 1898. I mean, two brothers, they traveled to East Africa, and from there onwards, the growth of this diaspora happened. Now, the period you have chosen from 1940 to 1980, in case of East Africa, it represents the growth, or you can say the rise of Jain diaspora as well as decline of diaspora, because many people came to England, they migrated to North America or back to India after the Africanization process in the wake of the nationalist movement there, and like that. So at one time, for example, in 1963, there were probably as many as 32,000 Jains in the 3 countries of East Africa. And later on, of course, by 1980, the decline was quite significant, and maybe hardly 15,000 or so Jains must be there. In case of USA, it was in fact the beginning of, by 1980, a small Jain community of maybe 20,000 Jains. So the period is very nice that you have started, for your study when these communities were small. But I request you to continue this study in post 1980 era also, so that a good monograph can come up on this very theme. Well, you mentioned in your conclusion that people don't know about the practical Jainism, the way it is practiced or applied Jainism. I would say that this is actually a problem of lack of social scientific studies, whether from the point of view of ethnography or anthropology or sociology, since these kind of researches on Jain communities are hardly there. It is because of this that we often and most of the time have to study only that what you call orthodox Jainism or Jain doctrines. Most of the researches in India, they end up with only ahimsa, aparigraha, or other karma theory or things like that. And there is hardly any good studies on sociological, anthropological, or these ethnographic aspect relating to Jain communities. And so once these are there, more in number, I think the practical side of Jainism would also be revealed, that will come to light. And then one can, of course, compare and contrast it with the Jain doctrines. So, this is one thing. Now, once you extend your, suppose this analysis or ethnographic study of mendicant layman interaction, then I think you can include, for example, this Paryushan Parv. And you can also include the Pandits, the traditional scholars, Jain scholars, who often visit North America, different places, and they are invited to give these, pravachans on Paryushan Parv. So that will be a good part of the study, and that would also include, because much of your discussion is obviously based on Shwetambar traditions, except of course you mentioned this Kanji Swami once visiting this thing. But once you visit these, once you include these Pandits, then probably Digambar component can also be included in that. Then one can also examine the role of these Jain TV channels, which are here, and to what extent they fulfill the need of these, mendicants there abroad. That is a question to be studied. So I think with these kind of certain things. Now, one thing what I expected, as part of layman and mendicant interaction, that the impact is in terms of, the more on spiritual side, or more on this just well-being side, as Code mentioned. One can operationalize this interaction in terms of these two aspects, the sacred and secular, and probably, assess the impact much better and much more, in sociological as well as ethnographic manner. So I think this is an excellent study, and topic is certainly multidisciplinary, and there is of course a knowledge gap which you try to fulfill in a very nice manner. And I again invite you to please extend this analysis up to date so that a better study could be done on this very topic itself as to what is the status of Jainism in diaspora. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do I have 1 minute to
Sure.
Mainly to thank Professor Prakash ji for a range of very good comments. And I have been working, because I mainly do ethnography and I do field work in the Jain community now. I have a lot of data and a lot of thoughts about sort of things that happened after 1980 and about how to unpack this. But then the last question about, is this more spiritual or more well-being benefit? It is so compounded these days that it's very difficult to eke that out, but it's an interesting sort of line of inquiry nonetheless. But I really also wanted to thank you, Professor Jain, for really writing the first real work on Jain sociology about Jains, well, as in India as well as outside of South Asia.
Others
in India and abroad
probably
has helped me a lot.
Thank you. But I consider, work of Dr. Sangwe the great work and very classical work, and one can draw inspiration from him. Excellent work. And of course, Sadhu. And now I consider Coates' work, particularly this idea of, if anything, one single thing which has come out of Western studies of Jainism, then I think this study, this concept, unfortunately, although he did, just in one study, but it needs to be operationalized and studied all over and see whether among Digambars also the concept applies or not. I am sure it will apply to all the Jains, but how to do it, how to further investigate, that's a very interesting line of study.
Thank you, Prakash ji. Yeah, thank you, Professor Prakash ji, and thank you, Chidev ji. And I would now request Ashok sir to say the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everybody. It is a matter of immense pleasure and pride to propose a vote of thanks on this very, very valuable lecture, which systematically presented the history and detailed account of the monks, yatis, sadhvis who traveled outside India to propagate Jainism and create awareness among the international audience. Yeah, I congratulate you and we are very grateful that you prepared such an elaborate lecture on this topic. I also express my sincere thanks to the chairman of this session, Dr. Prakash ji, who is an authority on the sociological aspect of Jainism, and the valuable inputs he gave to the speaker. I think the speaker has definitely benefited from his insight. I would like to express our gratitude to our celebrities who are at the helm of the affairs of ISJS, Dr. Sulekji, Dr. Suganchan Jain, Dr. Jaswant Modi, Dr. Narendra Parasar, Dr. Pramod Modi, who have been always helpful and encourage for such activities to be undertaken by the ISJS. I also found that there are so many learned scholars, prominent scholars from all over the world. I will like to propose my sincere thanks to Dr. Christopher Miller, Dr. Patricia, Dr. Salim Jain from Delhi, Dr. Professor Anna, Dr. Ved Vyas Pandey from Lucknow, and so many other, Dr. Manish Modi from Bombay, Dr. Trisa from Delhi, and a host of learned audience have encouraged us. So we are very thankful to them that they have spared their valuable time to encourage us, and I hope they will keep encouraging us by their liberal, generous gesture. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. If you have any comments, questions, and I would like you to just think about what Tine talked about today. And we would love to have more talks like this. Thank you so much. See you again next month.
Okay.